When I looked at Final Fantasy III as the end of the Famicom era for the series, I saw the game as being reflective of the biggest ideas that came before, while still pushing the series into new and previously unexplored territory. I opened this video by thinking back to the third installment because I see a lot of similarities between FF3 and 5. I'm not the first to make this comparison, but I do see a deeper connection between the philosophies of these two specific installments than just the surface level resemblances. The description that I just gave for FF3 can largely be applied to FF5 as well, just that instead of rounding off the Famicom titles, this one rounds off the entire classic era of the series. I understand that that's not the most popular way to interpret these games, but between this video and the eventual Final Fantasy VI one, I trust that you'll at least understand where I'm coming from when I say that Final Fantasy V is the last classic FF game. Regardless of those semantics though, another strong similarity between Final Fantasy III and V is that in the modern fanbase, they're probably the least talked about installments across the entire series. It's easy to dismiss this as a byproduct of both games having skipped English releases, but just like with FF3, while this did likely play a part in it, once again I don't think this is the whole story. However, unlike FF3, Final Fantasy V did face some unique challenges just as a result of being the successor to Final Fantasy IV, and they're ones that I believe have tainted the game's perception forever. Final Fantasy V is a game that I've been familiar with for some time now. I first played the game right after I first played FF4, but unlike that game, I only played through 5 once, and I never really thought about why that was until it came time to make this video. Revisiting it for this was a strange experience with a lot of conflicting thoughts, but ultimately, I feel like I've come to a greater understanding of not only the game itself, but why its legacy feels so muted compared to the rest of the series. Before I get into that though, I want to once again touch on all of the different releases of the game. And don't worry, this won't take nearly as long as last time. Firstly, the original release of the game. If you saw my last video on FF4, you'll remember that I mentioned that I felt like the original version of that game has actually aged pretty well for the most part, to the point where I would recommend it, and that same sentiment does apply to Final Fantasy V as well. It's a bit slower, and the menus aren't as snappy as you might expect from more modern releases, but everything still moves at a reasonable pace and functions as intended here. This is the version that I played for the first time, and I can confidently say it's a very good way to play the game. Presentation-wise, FF4 was already a pretty huge leap in every area, but 5 manages to improve on everything even further, and it makes that clear as soon as you boot up the game. Previous entries either dumped a monologue on you or just tossed you into the title screen, but FF5 has this really cute animation of Bartz and Boko running through the letters of the logo while the main theme of the game plays, and I think it does a great job at setting the tone for the adventure ahead, as well as just being an impressive technical showcase. The intro isn't the only technical improvement though. It's not long before cutscenes show up, which have substantially more involved blocking this time around. Characters are not only moving around more than ever, but they each have so many different sprites for different emotions, and they come off as way more expressive than before as a result. It also helps sell a lot of the physical comedy that the game is going for. Basically, none of this would have worked without these improved animations. In fact, it's not just the animations and cutscenes that benefit from the extra sprites. There are so many different looks for every character in this game. It's honestly kind of overwhelming to think about. Not to get too ahead of myself here, but every party member in the game has 22 unique designs, one for each job, but characters are still distinct from each other even if they share the same job. Combine all of that with all of the different poses that they have to be in for their battles? Yeah, they fit a ton of data into this game, but it only looks better for it. But the visuals are also improved just on the basis of the team being more familiar with the Super Famicom hardware. Colors really pop in this game, characters and environments look more detailed than ever, it's a very nice looking game all around. Even Mode 7 gets more creative usage at some points here, like I've always loved this shot of the meteor crashing down to Earth. And the soundtrack, as expected by this point, is pretty fantastic too. I won't pretend like this game's music has the same impact on me that FF4's does, but regardless of that, FF5 has a pretty remarkable soundtrack full of amazing songs that truly elevate the underlying game underneath it all. It delivers on capturing all the emotions you'd expect in a journey like this, so of course that means the excitement of battle and adventure. But it also means the quieter moments, like reflecting on a nostalgic past. and it hits all the notes you could picture in between all of that. Something else I notice is that the percussion sounds are actually a lot more varied across this soundtrack, and that's not to say that it all sounded identical before. There was variety in 4 as well, but I find it to be so much more noticeable here, as there are actually multiple sections in which the percussion is very much driving the feel of the song. For example, there's the upbeat clapping, which is perfect for exploring a lively village. But there's also the dangerous thumping toms that underscore danger and tension when you're facing off against X-Death. Another aspect that I find takes a lot of prominence in Final Fantasy V specifically are the bass lines. More so than any other game in the series, they really stand out to me here because of how frequently they create interesting counter melodies. That last song, Battle at the Big Bridge, has actually ended up being one of the most iconic songs of the entire series. So many future games would go on to remix it in some way, and I think that it speaks volumes to the quality of these original compositions that not only are they still so widely recognized decades down the line, but that the original rendition is still one of the best, despite the countless incredibly talented composers that have since made alternate arrangements. All in all, while it may not be one of my personal favorites, the soundtrack to FF5 is undeniably pretty killer, and especially if you're playing this through an emulator with a good pair of headphones, it still holds up incredibly well. Uematsu came through for the 5th game in a row with a truly outstanding work, and as these soundtracks get bigger and bigger alongside the expanding scale of each game, it's hard not to be impressed that up to this point, Uematsu is still the sole composer for these games. So, the original Super Famicom release is, as expected, a solid technological improvement in every area. However, this release is actually a lot more interesting if you consider how it's played by Western audiences. I mentioned briefly that Final Fantasy V was originally not released in the West. There were plans to initially, and it was meant to be called Final Fantasy III, to follow the naming scheme established with FF4's localization where that game was titled FF2. However, all of this fell through because, according to Square, the game was just too difficult to be accessible. As for how true that statement is, well, I'll get to that later, but regardless, the game was initially still set to be released, just under the name Final Fantasy Extreme instead, except this ended up falling through as well. But Final Fantasy V is one of the first examples ever of a playable fan translation spreading across the internet. With the rise of emulation in the 90s, there were a few different groups that attempted to translate the game but never finished the project. But finally, a group by the name of RPGE pulled together and released a fully playable English version of the game in 1997, a whole 2 years before the first official English release Square would eventually put out. This makes the Final Fantasy V translation, which I should also note is still the most popular way to play the original Super Famicom version of the game, one of the first playable fan translations in video game history. I've relied on fan translations for this entire video series to capture footage of the original versions of these games, either because they're my only option, or because I feel that they capture the original releases better than the localization efforts of the time did. Square is never going to re-localize these original versions, so all of these are incredibly important for preservation, something that I'm extremely grateful for. But I wanted to give special attention to this one because it paved the way for so many others. There are plenty of significant games that, if it weren't for FF5, would be completely unplayable in English, and I think it's pretty cool that the Final Fantasy series gets to have this incredibly important piece of wider gaming history. And for what it's worth, despite its age, this fan translation still holds up pretty well. The conversion to English feels extremely natural, and while certain names would later be changed in the official localizations, yes, I'm talking about Bart's, this is a remarkably solid effort that has aged much better than Square's own efforts with FF4 and 6 in my opinion. All that being said though, in 1999, Final Fantasy V would finally get an English release on the PlayStation, released as a part of the Final Fantasy Anthology Collection. It's essentially the same as the Super Famicom original, just with longer loading transitions before battles and a slightly worse sounding soundtrack. It's not a terrible way to play the game, it's just, there's absolutely no reason to play it at this point. The next release though, Final Fantasy V Advance, this is better. It's got the portable factor, which isn't so much of a novelty anymore, but at the time it was pretty nice. And hey, credit where credit is due, the soundtrack here is much better than it was in FF4 Advance. You may remember from the last video that I completely slammed that version of the game for its horrendous audio quality, but 5 Advance, in comparison, is pretty nice on the ears. not getting Super Famicom level sound quality, but the audio here is still far from bad. And on top of all that, you're getting a revamped script that's more faithful to the original Japanese text than the PlayStation translation. But the main reasons to play this version come from the improved pace of the game thanks to a few nice quality of life changes and the extra content. If you haven't guessed by this point in the Retrospective series, I'm not the type to get hung up on additional content in these games. For the most part, if it's not in the original, I don't care. But there are people that do care, and if the extra jobs and dungeons in the advanced port are appealing to you, this is the only place you're gonna get that. Okay, that's technically not true. You can also get this content in the 2013 mobile release, but I just have to say this as bluntly as possible. Do not play this version. It's the same as the advanced release, only with some truly hideous visuals and HUD design that really make this the only bad version of the game. This was also what was available on Steam for a few years, but at this point it's been delisted from all platforms, so you'd really have to go searching for it, and it is not worth that effort. The version that's replaced it on Steam, as well as any other modern platform, is the Pixel Remaster, and just like the rest of the Pixel Remasters, this does away with the bonus content in the previous versions. I know that's a turnoff for some, but for me, again, I couldn't care less. Presentation-wise, well, it's mixed territory again. It looks as good as the rest of the Pixel Remasters, but I have to say, in my eyes, this looks worse than the original. Okay, that's kinda harsh, let me explain. Everything individually looks fine, it's just that when the whole image comes together, I'm not sold. The game's color palette is noticeably brighter than its predecessors, and this was true of the original as well, but when the rest of the Pixel Remasters were already brighter than their original counterparts, and FF5 comes in tipping the balance even further, it just takes it a step too far in my opinion. This isn't new either, the advanced version also has this problem, but the difference is that that was on a handheld where visual compromises were expected, and it's got the extra content to fall back on. So there's the coloring issue, but unfortunately that's not all. The main issue here is that the evolving visuals of the original games have finally caught up with the stagnant art style of the Pixel Remasters. Just about everything in the game looks at least as good, if not better, in the Super Famicom original, and it really draws my attention to how hastily constructed these remasters are. The original game was built around a resolution of 256 by 224, and so obviously the sprites were built to accommodate that, but they were made in tandem with the menus, the background, everything else on screen that was also meant to share that relatively tiny resolution. Here, with the remaster, everything looks like it was built individually and then drag and dropped onto a 1080p canvas. I'm fully aware that I'm nitpicking at things that most people don't care about, but Final Fantasy V really is the point where this kind of thing starts to bother me. Still though, I can't bring myself to call this a bad version. It's got the modern official script, extremely quick gameplay thanks to all the quality of life changes from the advanced version and more, and while I have complained about the modifiers before, I'm not gonna lie, they can be a lot of fun in this game if you just want to go nuts seeing what the job system has to offer, or if you just can't handle the game's difficulty. And of course, it's got that amazing remastered soundtrack. I think that we're past the point where I can easily call these the best versions of these songs, but that mainly has to do with the fact that the originals just sound so good at this point. These are fantastic arrangements that are absolutely worth listening to. So that's all the versions down. Once again, I recorded footage of the Pixel Remaster because despite all of my nitpicking, it is the most easily accessible version and the easiest for me to record footage of. And I can't lie, I do really love hearing this remastered music. But once again, we're past the point where I believe that the original versions of these games are too outdated for most to enjoy. If you're looking for an authentic representation of the series' evolution and have a bit of patience, that's the version that I would personally recommend. But there's nothing wrong with settling on the advanced version or the Pixel Remaster either. But alright, all the version differences and presentation talk aside, there's still the underlying game underneath all that to discuss. There's a lot of places I could start, but seeing as FF4 saw the series shift priorities into storytelling so hard, I think it's appropriate to begin there. Even the game opens up with story. After the animated intro, you're thrust into a cutscene where things are looking pretty dire and serious. The music is all dramatic, the wind crystal has shattered, a meteor is crashing down, it looks like things are picking up really fast. And I find this opening so interesting because it is a really effective hook to rope you into the game's story, but it's also lying to you. The tone of this opening scene is completely at odds with the actual goal of this game's storytelling. This is much more in line with what I would expect from a game like Final Fantasy IV. It works well, but it gives me entirely false expectations of what's to come. I understand that introducing the story with a claim like that naturally leads to the question of, well then how is this different from FF4? And don't worry, we will get there, but first I want to take some time to just talk about what the game is doing by its own standards, and once I've established that, then I'll rope it back around and start comparing it to previous games in the series. So pretty soon after this intro, you start picking up party members, and within less than an hour, you'll have a full party of 4. And yes, I said 4, but we'll get back to that later. But this set of 4 characters is pretty much solid throughout the entire game. Bart, Lena, Galuf, and Ferris are the 4 heroes of Final Fantasy V, and a lot of the game is just focused on the banter between these 4. In fact, I'll say right now that FF5's story is much more vibe-focused above all else, and these characters play a large role of that. The most memorable parts of the game for me aren't the big story beats, and that's not to say that they don't exist here, it's just that they aren't standouts, and for the most part, I really don't think that they're trying to be. And that naturally puts a big emphasis on these 4 characters. So how are they? Well, Bart is a fairly typical shonen-type protagonist. He may not always be the brightest, but he's got a big heart and a love of adventure. Lena is a princess as the daughter of King Tycoon, but she's brave and not afraid to take matters into her own hands, and this is actually what leads her to joining the team in the first place. Galuf is the grandpa of the group. He may start the game a bumbling amnesiac, but eventually he comes to take on the role of a wise mentor figure, but he always retains his goofy personality. Ferris is, in my opinion, the most interesting character of the group by far. You meet this character as the captain of a group of pirates, and they've got the personality to match, too. They can be crude, brash, and ferocious to the rest of the group, especially when you first meet them. The group actually assumes Ferris to be a man at first, but before long it's revealed that she is actually a woman, just one raised by pirates and comfortable in that lifestyle. The more that you spend time with her, the more you start to see underneath the surface, and the more you see how much of an affectionate side she can really have, especially when it comes to her sea dragon Sildra. Later it's revealed that Ferris is actually Lena's long-lost sister, making her a princess alongside Lena. Ferris, pretty understandably, hates this at first, even going so far as to run away from the family the moment she gets the chance. But still, she eventually comes to terms with it and accepts her heritage as a part of her identity without feeling the need to compromise her personality. I think the thing that makes these characters work for this game is the natural banter that comes with their easily identifiable personalities. Combined with the more expressive animation made possible with that Super Famicom hardware, FF5 has a pretty comedic tone for most of its runtime, which I think fits really well for a game that puts priority on individual moments above all else. And for what it's worth, the banter that comes from the party is pretty entertaining. Not all of the game's humor has aged super well, there's a lot of slapstick that just feels tired in a modern context, and some scenes like when Parts finds out Ferris is a woman come off more creepy than anything else, but I wouldn't say that these ever really detract from the game. And when the humor does work, usually it really works. One point of the game I've always found especially memorable is when Exdeath, the main villain, manages to disguise himself as a splinter to track down the main party undetected. The dialogue after this reveal plays itself up so hard it's impossible not to laugh at the absurdity of it all, and they capitalize on this momentum by immediately having Exdeath fight in this Dragon Ball Z-ass showdown with a turtle. It's one of the craziest scenes in the entire series, absolutely no notes, it's perfect. So the game can deliver on the fun, but when it comes to actually taking these characters seriously, well, I think my thoughts are pretty clear from the fact that I have significantly more to say about Ferris than the rest of the cast. She's my favorite character in the game by a landslide, and to be brutally honest, the only one that I find remotely interesting. Don't get me wrong, I like Bart and Lena and Galuf, but I'm just not invested in their stories, and it's something that I can't attribute to anything other than personal preference. They all get their moments to shine, and since there's only 4 of them, nobody feels like they get lost in the shuffle. But I still just can't bring myself to care that much about them, and in a story that relies on its characters so much, I see that as a bit of an issue. Well, I say Ferris is my favorite, but in all honesty, the most memorable character in FF5 to me isn't even part of the main party at all. It's Gilgamesh. This dude has so much personality and fun dialogue in the middle of his battles, it's always so entertaining. Just as one example, during one fight with him, he transforms into a more powerful version of himself, and he starts talking up his new weapon Excalibur, only for him to deal pitiful damage before realizing it's a fake. This moment gets me every time, both for how it uses battle mechanics in a creative way to make a gag, but also for the sheer silliness of how dumbfounded Gilgamesh is by it all. He's a rival character that's just impossible to hate. It's another great example of the comedic aspects I was talking about earlier, and I always loved how he ends up switching sides and helping you by the end of the game. I've always thought that was a great way to send off his character. Gilgamesh is a fan favorite to anyone who's played FF5, and it's so easy to tell why. But alright, fans of the game have probably noticed that I've purposely excluded talking about Kryl up to this point, and honestly, it's because I don't really know how to introduce her. You meet her relatively early on where she's introduced as Galif's granddaughter, and she shows up intermittently throughout the game until a climactic scene, where Galif sacrifices himself to save the rest of the group. Suddenly, you're down an important party member, and that's where Kryl steps in to fill the void. This has always been an incredibly awkward sticking point for me with this game's story. Sure, Kryl is introduced well before she joins the party, but she never felt remotely as important as any of the main four. And at least for me, that never changed afterwards. And it's complicated, because on one hand, I really respect the idea of permanently killing off a core party member. I just can't help but feel this was the wrong game to do it. The death itself is actually done pretty well in my opinion, it's just that Kryl serving as his replacement throws off the balance of the whole cast. The entire last few hours of the game, I'm looking at the party, and Kryl feels like someone who showed up uninvited. It's not like the game doesn't try to make Kryl interesting in her own way, she gets her own moments to shine, but they all come so late and most of them revolve around her processing her grief over losing her grandfather. That's not enough to make your character interesting to me. I didn't care about her before Galif died, and I don't care about her anymore after. She's a glorified side character that got thrust into the party slot. Still, set aside the misstep with Kryl, I think the characters in this game are totally serviceable. The banter works, I like how each of them have a proper focus and their own moments to shine throughout the game, and I like how much individuality they all have compared to each other. But I wouldn't describe this story as a character-driven one. The interactions between these characters end up being the most memorable parts of the story, but they don't move the story forward. The plot itself, though, is actually the most coherent of the series so far. And yes, I understand that calling a plot competent isn't exactly the most glowing compliment, but I want to give credit where it's due. Just about every complaint I've had with the stories of previous FF games has been ironed out here. It's straightforward, has an easy to follow structure, doesn't pull any bullshit last minute reveals, but I'm not willing to call it anything more than competent because, well, to be blunt, it's just not anything special in my opinion. Serviceable, I think, is the perfect word to describe FF5's story in just about every aspect. It's ironed out a lot of the kinks of the previous game's stories, but it doesn't really do anything to make itself especially memorable. And part of me feels like Final Fantasy V doesn't really want you to take its story seriously. It's much more interested in having you remember the vibes of the game, the one-off moments, the charming environments, and I see this sentiment shared by a lot of others online. It's all fair enough, but at least for me, I don't feel comfortable using that as an excuse because the game very clearly does want you to care about it. That misleading intro I mentioned earlier that sets the tone for the whole story does not imply that it's not something you should be taking seriously, and it's still got those dramatic moments that try to invoke a response out of you, especially Galif's death. It's just that when the game focuses on that side of its tone, it falls short of being something genuinely special. Both times I've played Final Fantasy V now, I come away from the story so thoroughly uninterested, and that's a feeling that's only made worse by this game being easily the longest in the series up to this point. For everything that it does right on paper, I just find myself unable to get legitimately invested. And I know that sounds pretty scathing, but I feel like I should specify I'm only being this critical because on many levels, I think this game does come close to having the best story in the series up to this point. Like I said, all the issues I've had with previous stories are fixed, so it should be the best one by default, right? Well, to elaborate on why not, I'm gonna rope back to what I hinted at earlier and compare everything that FF5 is doing story-wise to its predecessors. Final Fantasy V's story structure expectedly takes a lot from what FF4 was doing, specifically with how it continues to lean away from role-playing and into direct storytelling. Characters all have predefined personalities and relationships once again, and while those can change throughout the game, they're not something that the player has any kind of say in. One of the most notable changes from 4 is that the cast of characters is significantly smaller. Instead of the gargantuan 12-person rotating party from that game, here you're only following the main 4 the vast majority of the time. 5 if you count Kryl. Even with Kryl in the mix though, the smaller number and the fact that every party member is consistently in the action means that every party member here feels more important than the majority of party members in 4, and I can only view that as a net positive. I mentioned earlier that every character with the exception of Kryl has plenty of time in the spotlight, and that almost feels like an intentional fix to the issue that FF4 had. Far and away the biggest difference to me between 4 and 5 is actually the emphasis on story. FF4 was very much a game where everything was built to serve the story. It was the main attraction, and FF5 just isn't really like that at all. If anything, I describe FF5's story more as a backdrop, so in that sense, it's actually much more similar to FF3. The similarities to FF3's story become even more apparent when you look at the tone. I've already mentioned how FF5 is pretty lighthearted, but again, this is especially evident when compared to 4, which takes itself relatively seriously pretty much all of the time. Something urgent always seems to be happening in that game, where 5 is much more laid back and similar to 3's approach. I think the best way to describe Final Fantasy V's story structure is that it combines the best aspects of what FF3 and 4 were doing with their stories. From 3 it takes the very moment-to-moment vibe-focused approach, and from 4 it takes the focus on well-defined characters and relationships, as well as a more linear sequence of events. It is a bit of a strange mix, because I feel like FF3's approach worked specifically because of how that game was structured around smaller vignettes, and 5 isn't really like that at all. It follows 4's footsteps more closely in that regard, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a problem because the moments themselves can still be pretty fun. If you've been following this retrospective series, you'll probably find that this description is very reminiscent of what I said about FF3's story, only this time, instead of combining the approaches of FF1 and 2, we're combining the approach of 3, which already had equal elements of the first two games, with 4, and it leads to this mix that feels like it's on the verge of cracking a formula, but I just can't help but feel the story overall is a downgrade from 4 just because it's given so much less importance. Structurally, I really do think that all the right choices were made to refine this series' storytelling capabilities in a new way that feels natural. But since the story itself is just inherently less important to the game's identity, it comes off as a lot less impressive and ambitious. But hey, nobody said that the story had to always be the top priority. And despite everything I've said up to this point, Final Fantasy V is able to get away with a relatively lackluster feeling story because it's the gameplay leading the experience this time around. And without an especially strong story to lean on, it's a good thing that FF5 can provide such a solid gameplay experience. Where FF4 had a rotating cast of characters that all had pre-assigned specific classes, FF5 has a static group of characters that don't adhere to anything like that. It means the story and gameplay aren't linked as closely as they were before, but it also allows the gameplay of this installment to be more of an open canvas that could focus on interesting mechanics without the fear of any narrative consequences. This is the same kind of canvas that led to so many interesting and experimental RPG mechanics throughout the Famicom trilogy, and it creates the perfect opportunity for FF3's job system to come back better and more expansive than ever. Just like Final Fantasy II and III, the RPG mechanics of FF5 completely define the experience. This game is known first and foremost for its job system. It naturally builds off the pre-existing job structure from FF3, but it improves the system so much into something genuinely great. Let's start with a quick refresher of what FF3 had. So in that game, the main idea was that you could switch the entire makeup of your team on the fly, often having you change your team as a sort of way to solve a puzzle. Earlier versions of the game also had restrictions on how often you could switch jobs, and switching jobs would set your magic level to whatever your previous maximum was. The more jobs that you got throughout the game, generally speaking, the more powerful those jobs were, with some being direct upgraded versions of previous jobs. One immediate change right off the bat with FF5 is the fact that in every single version of the game, even the Super Famicom original, there's no penalty for switching jobs, which is a great improvement. Switching jobs will still set your magic level back to the previous maximum, but it's much more forgiving here thanks to the returning MP system. Another difference is that you'll actually receive almost every job in the game relatively early on, and it can be a little overwhelming when you're first coming to grips with the game, but it does give you your full toolkit pretty early on. You'll notice though that none of these jobs are replacements for each other like they sometimes were in FF3, so that means that no job becomes obsolete and there's even more diverse options to choose from. Another total improvement in my opinion. These new options can be pretty fantastic as well. The Time Mage is a personal favorite of mine. It's a pretty unique job that makes tons of sense for the returning ATB system. I also love the Mystic Knight. It's a class that can infuse swords with certain elemental affinities to target those elemental weaknesses without having to rely on magic spells. And the Blue Mage would go on to become a series staple with its really interesting mechanic of letting you learn the abilities that enemies use on you. I've never really bothered with that kind of thing, but if you put the time into it, Blue Mages are truly a force to be reckoned with. And I could go on and on, but that's all relatively surface level stuff. The thing that really elevates the job system above and beyond are the abilities. But before I explain that, I'm once again going to jump back to Final Fantasy II and III. Both of these games aimed to make you consider long-term growth by adjusting your character's stats based on the roles that you had them serve in battle. The effort was appreciated, and in FF2 it was completely essential to the game. In FF3 it was less intrusive, but you could also easily ignore it as a result. You didn't really have to plan ahead, because although you would receive stat bonuses depending on the job that you've used, they were largely inconsequential. I remind you of all of this because FF5's ability system has found the perfect way to integrate the on-the-fly switching of the job system with the long-term planning those earlier titles were striving for. How it works is that every job you use has levels. Leveling up a job will get you an ability inherent with that job. For a mage, for example, you unlock higher tiers of the type of magic that mage uses, and these abilities can take different shapes. Sometimes it's more of a passive skill like the thief's ability to see hidden passageways, or the ability to equip certain types of equipment. Other times, it's a completely unique ability that takes up a slot on the command menu, like the samurai's Zenanage. Every time you select a job though, you'll notice an empty ability slot, and you can fill this with any ability that you've learned, and just like that, the floodgates of possibilities burst open. You can have a white mage use black magic with no drawbacks, you can have a berserker dual wield axes, you can have a bard mixing drinks like a chemist. The possibilities truly feel endless. But never before have I felt so completely in control of what I wanted my party to look like in this series. And on top of all of that, the job switching still lets you experiment with different setups at a moment's notice without abandoning any of the progress that you've made. The abilities really change the entire feel of the game, and the game is just tempting you to go nuts with these mechanics from the very start. I have a feeling this is why the game reduced the number of party members at any given moment from 5 in the last game back down to 4 like in the first 3. Managing jobs takes a lot of effort as is. I could envision it getting pretty overwhelming having to do all of that with yet another character. Maybe this is why Kryl didn't come in until after Galuf died. This was a good move if you ask me. I feel like 4 is the perfect number for a game like this where you're constantly conscious about tracking character builds. And by the way, this game will force you to use these mechanics. Final Fantasy V is very easily, without any kind of doubt, the hardest in the series up to this point. Remember that this game was considered so extreme that it skipped its original Western release. And I don't think it's that intense personally. Like, it definitely shouldn't have skipped the release over here, but it does require you to have legitimately solid builds for all 4 characters, and a lot of the bosses will make you rethink your strategy on the fly. Ultimately, I think the game's difficulty is a good thing, because like I said, it does legitimately make you use the tools given to you in an effective way. The bosses here can give you a lot of trouble if you're not prepared, and no one strategy will get you through them all. But that is exactly what makes them so great. Final Fantasy III had a lot of points both in and out of boss fights where there was a correct way to arrange your party, and it was more like a puzzle solution, but there's never any point like that here. With a lot of the bosses, typically you'll go in and die once or twice, figure out the unique mechanics of that fight, reorganize your team, go back in and overcome it. It's such a rewarding feeling that genuinely never gets old. These fights are Final Fantasy V at its best. The example that I and a lot of other people automatically point to is Atamos. This thing can kill your party members super fast, but that's kind of the whole point of the fight. Once a character gets killed, he'll stop attacking and drag your character further and further across the screen in real time. Let them go too far, and they're sucked into the void, completely removed from the battle. So it leads to this super engaging balancing act. You have to use ATB in a really careful way to make sure that nobody is in danger of being sucked into the void, but also that your team isn't taking too much heavy fire, all while keeping up the damage on him. Strategy is key here, and there's so many different ways to deal with it. Do you utilize time magic to more effectively control the flow of the ATB system in battle? Do you put everyone into a damage dealing role and gradually sacrifice them all, hoping to secure a kill as soon as possible? Or do you prioritize defense, minimize damage and revive your party members as soon as possible to avoid anyone getting dragged to the void? The truth is, all of these strategies are probably viable, and you could definitely come up with countless more that I didn't think of. It's situations like this that I feel like Final Fantasy V's gameplay is at its peak. It's the epitome of the play smarter not harder philosophy that this series has been gradually building to. One other thing I find very interesting about the job system is that even though it is technically more limited than FF2's very open mechanics, I felt like I was incentivized to use the job system in much more creative ways. Just as one example, I want to talk about one strategy that I actually used in both games, and that's having my mage attack with bare hands. In FF2, this almost felt like a cheap exploit because it was just logically the solution that made the most sense. I had all the possibilities in the world, but it felt like that was the only one that made sense. When I did this exact same thing in FF5 though, I felt so smart, and I think it's because doing it in this game required more build-up. I had to have the barehanded ability unlocked from leveling the monk job enough, so it did require some purposeful setup and consideration, and because of that it was something that I could only do to one character. It was not a default strategy that I could immediately apply to my entire party. And it wasn't as blatantly broken as before either. In FF2 your health leveled up from taking damage, so it was almost always the better long-term option to put yourself in harm's way. There's nothing like that here, so typically I would want my mages in the back row. Unless I have them equipped with the barehanded ability, because the back row reduces the damage dealt from physical attacks. Now putting my mage in either row has legitimate pros and cons. It's an active decision that I have to make. On top of that, so many of the jobs here just would not have been possible in a game like FF2 because the designers came up with so many unique abilities and mechanics. I can't imagine a game with a more open progression structure where all of these abilities exist, at least not one where they feel cohesive or natural. It's the structure that the job system provides that allows each character to still feel so unique. In short, I think that FF5's more streamlined and guided approach wins over FF2's completely open approach because FF2 is just too easy to optimize. I could do so many things, but most of them were just objectively worse than the easy strategies that I latched onto. FF5 avoids this problem by limiting and refining your options just enough so that all of them are useful in completely unique ways, and the ability system gives the player tons of self-expression, so you never feel the limitations that the game is imposing on you. It's incredibly smart game design. There's a reason that the job system in this game is so celebrated. If there's one critique I've seen about the job system in this game though, it's that, similarly to FF3, when it comes to the endgame, you'll more than likely be using one of two jobs, either the freelancer or the mime. The freelancer is more or less a blank slate that carries all passive abilities that a character has learned, and it has 2 open ability slots instead of just 1. The mime is more limited in what it can equip, it skews more towards magic builds, but it has a whopping 3 ability slots to make up for that. And the argument I've seen is that, since you're just going to be using these 2 jobs by the end anyway, it undercuts the importance of everything that you're building up throughout the entire game. I couldn't disagree more. Yes, it's technically true that you'll more than likely end up with a party of freelancers and mimes by the end of the game, but these classes are completely worthless without a full game's worth of preparation. You have the freelancer job available from the moment that you start the game, but it's pitiful without all the abilities and stat boosts that you'll have gained along the way. So unless you build up your party members identically, they will all look and play very differently from each other by the time that you reach the point where freelancer becomes viable again. Everybody in my team had a totally different skill set and utility by the time that I walked into that final dungeon, and I never felt even a little bit railroaded on my way to get there. These jobs and the versatility that they allow are exactly what makes the endgame of FF5 so great. But okay, before I talk about the endgame experience, let's go back and look at what the rest of the game looks like now that we understand the foundational mechanics. Most of the game, if you ignore the job system, is your standard Final Fantasy affair that you'd come to expect by this point, only once again refined even further. I don't think the pacing is quite as quick as FF4, and sometimes it can be a drag because of that, but overall, it's exactly what you'd expect. Dungeons are back and better than ever with significantly more interesting designs than we've ever seen from the series before. A lot of them this time around have pretty interesting gimmicks, like the constantly ticking countdown of Karnak Castle, for example. And on top of that, I found that there was much more of an emphasis on exploration here than any of its predecessors. And this pairs especially well with the job system since some of the abilities you can learn, like for example the Hidden Passage ability, can seriously help you even outside of combat. There's a few small changes to fit the structure of the job system better, like how magic is bought from stores again instead of learned through level ups. However, I do have to admit I like the magic purchasing system in this game a lot more than in the Famicom trilogy, because it's just a one-time purchase per spell and then the whole party can use it, assuming that they have the necessary job or ability, of course. Unfortunately, one sticking point for me that was carried over from FF4 is how occasionally you'll have sections of the game where certain party members are inaccessible for story reasons. And these are typically fairly brief, but they're memorably annoying because of how they directly fly in the face of your planned team compositions. Yes, you can always change jobs to compensate, but you're still down a lot of abilities and it just feels unnecessarily limiting. The absolute worst example of this is having to go through the Pyramid of Moor without Lena. It's a dungeon that would have been annoying no matter what, but it's made so much worse by her absence. And that's actually most of what I have to talk about in terms of significant differences. Like I said, we're on the 5th game by this point, you pretty much know what to expect. However, the most substantial structural change in my opinion is how the game handles its side content, especially in the endgame. Side content previously mostly boiled down to optional chests and enemy encounters that didn't really get you anything, with the occasional extra dungeon or boss battle with a summon. And those summon battles do still exist here, but it's once you get to the final overworld that the game really cracks open. Most of the final overworld is actually technically optional, but honestly that's part of what I love about it. You've made it through pretty much all the story beats in the game, so it sets up these legendary weapons for you, alongside a few extra powerful summons and spells that you can track down if you wish to, but then it just lets you go. You have to get at least 3 of the 12 legendary weapons, but after that, you're free to just go blazing into the final dungeon whenever. Fair word of warning though, don't do that. The final dungeon is an incredibly difficult gauntlet of demanding boss fights with consistently dangerous encounters and a fairly hefty length, though not as bad as something like FF3's infamous Crystal Tower. And even if you somehow do make it through, the final boss is exceptionally challenging, by far the hardest boss in the series, yet with no competition. So yeah, you'll want to go after that optional content to build up your team as much as you can before you enter the void. But this section of the game where I was mainly going through these final preparations gave me such a fantastic sense of control over my playthrough. I loved that I could pick out which of the legendary weapons I wanted to best complement my team, though I ended up going after all of them anyway. I made sure to get all the summons and the spells that I could, but most importantly, I took this opportunity to really prepare my team. A little backstory for this part. When I first played FF5 when I was 17 or so, I got my ass kicked hard by this final dungeon, and especially the final boss. I didn't take the opportunity to prepare to the level that I should have, and I really suffered for it. It was brutal. So when I came back to the game for this video, I was completely confident I would not let that happen again. I grinded a lot more than I actually needed to be completely honest. Mastering all of the jobs I'd been utilizing throughout my playthrough, building up new ones because I had read about their useful abilities online, I was going in with a bulletproof plan. I scoured online resources looking through all the jobs and what abilities I could get from them. I spent hours building up my AP levels as high as possible to make sure I was getting every last ability that I wanted. The first time I used rapid fire while dual wielding legendary weapons, effectively giving me 8 attacks in one turn, and I saw those damage numbers balloon to ridiculous heights. God, it felt like I was breaking the game in half, but in the best way. It's the same feeling I got when I started dual casting those ultimate spells like Holy and Flare. It took a lot of work, but God, the reward was so worth it. And just to be clear, I didn't have to do any of this. When I finally got to the final dungeon, I shredded through it like it was nothing. Even the final boss, I had to redo once because I forgot to make my team equip ribbons, but after I fixed that, Neo X-Death went down with little to no issue. I could have ended the game hours earlier, but I was so driven by the possibilities of what I knew I could achieve with the job system that I extended my playthrough that much longer because of it. And if that's not the sign of an exceptional RPG system, I don't know what is. And you know the crazy thing? Some people would say I barely scratched the surface. Even with my endgame build, I still didn't stand a chance against Omega, arguably the first super boss in the series. He's totally optional and easy to avoid, but should you choose to take him on, God help you. Even past that, the challenge run community for this game is unbelievable. They're constantly pulling off stuff that I can barely even comprehend. You will never catch me doing a 4-job fiesta, I can say that much, but huge props to the people that can do that kind of thing. I won't bother getting into it here, but take a look into it if you're interested, it's really cool. Fans of FF5 will frequently argue that it has some of, if not the best RPG mechanics in the entire series. And I have to agree on that front. The job system is legitimately fantastic, and I hope I've been able to express why. I don't think I'd go as far as to say that they're my favorite of the entire series, but we'll save that for future videos. With all the glowing praise that I and many others have for it though, it begs the question, why is Final Fantasy V brought up so little relative to other games in the series? I've thought about this question a lot since I started working on this video, and every time I thought I'd landed on an answer, I would quickly become dissatisfied with it. At first I thought it was because it was mostly a collection and refinement of previous ideas that didn't really bring much in the way of legitimately new concepts to the series. But then I thought about how the abilities system so completely transformed the pre-existing job system, and how the open structure of the game's final overworld busted open the formula in a way that many future games would follow. And I really don't feel comfortable in saying that anymore. Ultimately though, I feel like if there's any one aspect that tainted the game's perception forever, it's the fact that it released right after Final Fantasy IV. That game was just a monumental shift in priorities for the series, and 5 does not follow through on that. At least not in the way that I think most people would expect. Ideas from 4 were followed up on, certainly, but they were mixed with a lot of conflicting ideas from the original trilogy, and it ultimately turns this particular installment into a different direction than 4 seemed to be implying. And I don't want to talk too much about FF6 before we really get there, but if you know anything about that game, I think it's clear that that's what most people had in mind when they picture a follow-up to FF4's ideas. And this is only exacerbated by the fact that in North America, that jump from FF4 to 6 is exactly what most players experienced. Even the earliest fan translation of 5 wasn't available until the series had already passed Final Fantasy VII, so it only ever could have been viewed as the awkward middle child of the Super Famicom trilogy. I don't think it's the most fair position for this game to be in, but I can't say it's unwarranted. I love parts of Final Fantasy V, I really do, but everything with the story and aesthetic of this game is just so nothing to me, and it feels especially bad coming off of FF4. While that game didn't have the best story, it was still extremely memorable and ambitious in its own ways. 5 just isn't, and if you compare 5 to 6, let's just say the comparison becomes even less favorable. At this point, FF5 shares the same fate as FF3, having been relegated to a game that most people only really check out if they plan on playing the entire series. I know big Final Fantasy fans that have played most installments in this series, but still have yet to touch either 3 or 5. And it's unfortunate, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't understand why. 5 slots into the series' evolution pretty perfectly as the last classic Final Fantasy game. It's a culmination of all the ideas that defined the series' beginnings just before it made the jump into truly legendary territory. But because it spends so much time looking back, it doesn't really look forward in the same direction that the series was headed. Time has not been fair to Final Fantasy V, but it is a game that will always have its fans for obvious reasons. It's not the same kind of experience that you're getting with the most celebrated installments in the series, but by its own merits, it holds up pretty well. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that prefer what this game has to offer than what future games would. So it may not represent what Final Fantasy would eventually come to be, but if you ask me, it's a pretty charming representation of everything that the series once was.